Do you struggle painting mountains like the ones over my shoulder? If you do, you're in luck. I'm gonna go step by step in a full broken down tutorial that goes extremely in depth on how to paint mountains perfectly. This is a must-see for any brand new painter that wants to become a mountain master. Here we go. Oh boy, I hope you strap in because this is a long and detailed one. We're first gonna start with a distant mountain. Not super distant because that's actually really easy and we can do that in another video. We're gonna do a mountain that is distant enough but still has some slight detail in it. When you do one of these, it actually adds a lot of depth to your landscape painting, making it look like it has many layers and many dimensions. Let's first talk about the paintbrush you'll be using. While you're free to use any paintbrush that you want, I highly suggest using an angled shader. The reason is that angular cut in the bristles makes it extremely easy for any painter, but especially brand new ones, to form any shape mountain that they want that has as many peaks, ridges, and valleys in it. That angular cut really helps out. Now, if you don't have an angled shader, you can get away with a smaller fan brush or even a filbert brush. All right, on to our color. Now we're gonna use a light gray. All I did was take a little bit of black, a little bit of red, and a little bit of blue, and then I added white to that mixture to lighten it up to make a very light gray. Now, whatever mixture you go with, because you are free to choose your own colors, make sure you do lighten it up. For one strong reason. The lighter the color, it's gonna make it look like there's actual light diffusion in your painting, hence which would really happen in your environment. Remember, this mountain is way, way, way far back, and in real life, when you have a lot of light that cascades between you and your viewpoint and the object at a distance, there's a lot of reflection and diffusion happening on within the atmosphere, making it so you don't have a lot of detail and not a lot of sharp contrast. So remember that, okay, when you're creating your distant mountains. Now, when you load up your angled shader, you don't need to load it up with a lot of paint. We're not trying to make a strong contrast. Just add a little bit to both sides of those angled bristles. Now we can approach the canvas. When you're making the shapes of a distant mountain, don't think about how many peaks and valleys it has. Too many beginner painters out there put extreme peaks and extreme valleys. When something's really far back, again, it doesn't have a lot of detail. So just add some slight peaks and some slight valleys, but remember to cascade it out down to the sides because that's gonna help us create depth later on in our painting here. With that angle shader brush, just go up, down, and create just some simple shapes and only worry about the outer edge. When you have an outer edge that you like, just use that angle shader and pull down the remaining paint and start forming your actual mount side so that way you actually have a visual to follow. Now, don't think about it too much. Wherever you see highlights or shadow sides, just start scratching it in. Being free and loose here will help a lot. You'll actually see how far my hand is back on my paintbrush because I want to be free and loose with my strokes. Now, at any point of this video, feel free to pause and add more or less of whatever you want in any one of these elements here. For your mountain, if you want to add more peaks or more valleys, feel free to brush stroke them in. If you have too much paint or too little paint, feel free to add more or take away less by cleaning off your paintbrush and scrubbing it away, okay? We're just trying to create an outer edge and a visual for our brain to kind of see where we need to go. This is gonna help you a ton. You know what I almost forgot to mention is if you really struggle getting your paint to stick on top of your canvas because you feel like it's too wet or slick or nothing's grabbing, and I'm sure you're shaking your head right now, a really simple trick is what I recommend is take just a little bit of a blue shop towel here and fold it into a triangle and go over the inside of where your mountain is and slightly just start rubbing out that excess paint. But when we wipe some of it away, it's going to expose the toothing on the canvas, allowing our paint to grab onto something, allowing us to create more detail. This is gonna be a real cool trick that you're gonna see later on when we get to our big mountain. When it comes to pulling down color and really shaping your mountain so that way you have more of a visual of how you can see it, I recommend cleaning off your angled shader brush so it's extremely clean and using that as your edging tool to go to the edge of the outside of your mountain and start pulling down in the angles that you need to. Most people will use a 1-inch brush here, and while I do recommend that for the next step coming up, using this angled shader will give you a lot more control so that way you can actually go up to that edge and start pulling down what you want, or you can bump things in or bump things down so that way you can create even more shapes. It's just less intimidating and you're gonna have way more control, which is gonna help you build confidence. Next, we kind of want to anchor our mountain in our environment. We're going to take a clean 1-inch brush and work around the base of our mountain and start blending these strokes in and out. We want to work with that liquid white base underneath to create the illusion of depth and help influence or enhance that light diffusion that would occur when light bounces off the base of the mountain, creating that milky tone or that white tone, which is really going to be easy to do with that natural white underneath because it's going to make a gradient. Just pull your strokes in the same angle that you want to pull your mountain down, so the way it really creates those crevasses and peaks and valleys that you want to have. Again, spend some time here, have a light touch, and really think about what angles you want your mountain to follow in, okay? Now, to be honest, I think our mountain actually looks really good the way it is, and you could actually stop here and continue moving on to other elements like clouds or building your midground if you wanted to. But if you want to take it a step further and add some slight details to really enhance your mountains, we can add some diffused highlights and some diffused shadows, okay? Now our light source here is coming from my right-hand side. If you're a left-handed painter, just flip the steps here, okay? Put your highlights on your left side. That's gonna be easier for you. Now we're gonna take our angled shader brush, that's clean by the way, and load it up with a little bit of titanium white. And I do mean a little bit because we can always add more with the steps I'm about to talk about. Wherever you think light is coming down and kissing or catching any of the rocks or peaks or crevasses or whatever you think is going on within your mountain, just start to slightly slash them in with your paintbrush. You're only adding a little bit of detail here. You don't want to push too hard. Again, your eye shouldn't really be able to see a lot of enhanced details. It should just see vague shapes, colors, and contrasts, okay? Remember that as you're creating your distant mountain. Just go in and add highlights where you think it needs to be. This highlighting section allows you to build more character to your mountain if you want it to have peaks or certain spots that just kind of, stand out a little bit. Once you have all your highlights in, we can enhance those highlights by putting in some slight diffused shadows. Clean off your angled shader and take more of that gray mixture tone and put a little bit on. Wherever you added a highlight, on the opposite side, just add in a little bit of shadow by, adding a few brush strokes. You can do a couple slashes, a little bit of pushes, whatever you feel most comfortable with. But again, don't overdo it. But feel free to add some darker spots and some lighter spots. This is gonna really make your mountain feel more three-dimensional and give it a lot of character. Now we just have to work our diffused highlights and diffused shadows into our mountain because again, we don't need a lot of detail. You can use a clean angled shader or fan brush here to slightly brush things in, or if you feel confident enough, a very clean and dry 1-inch brush works fantastic here. Make sure to go all the way up and down your mountain. And again, remember your shape of your mountain. You don't want to destroy that because you want it to have some kind of visual stance of where everything is for the highlights and shadows and how it's forming. Now I'm gonna say this looks fantastic and it was actually really easy to do. You just need to go slow and only add a little bit of paint, and that angled shader will change your life when forming distant mountains or just mountains in general. Now if you want to add even more detail, which I actually don't really recommend because again, we want this in the background, but if you live in an area like I do in Southern California, when you have mountains, you have a lot of erosion. And I don't know what it's called, but you have these little highlights and shadow areas that come down and almost what looks like rivers running down it, okay? And if you want to add some slight details like this, you can do it with your highlights or shadows, by the way. You can take your script liner in a very thinned down paint and just slightly add in some of these little ripple lines. Now again, you don't need a lot of paint, but take your brush and move it around so it looks like there's different ways the erosion was kind of going down or the water was going down your mountain. Remember to twirl your brush so that paint comes nice and off, but you don't need a lot. When you've created a few shapes here, go back and clean it up either with a very soft fan brush or angled shader, or again, if you're confident enough, with a clean, dry 1-inch brush. Just fluff it up and dissipate it down at the bottom there, and there you have a beautiful mountain with some slight detail that you can see right at the top. Now you'll notice I didn't talk too much about the bottom of my mountain because you can pretty much save that for the very end of when you've put in all your detail. I recommend using a 1-inch brush here so you have more control. All you need to do is just tap out the base of the mountain following the angles that you've already created. Once you've done that, clean off your 1-inch brush and then start feathering and fanning up the same angles that you created your mountain. This will create the illusion that there's No detail at the bottom, like light diffusion is hitting it and blowing out the actual visuals for you and I, which is really going to enhance that illusion of depth. So just slightly feather it up. Once you've slightly feathered up, you can do some slight cross strokes at the bottom, which I recommend doing because that's gonna work off excess paint. And now we can lay something in front of it or put layers on top of it. I'm actually just gonna make this easy and just put some very, very basic clouds in front of it. So that way you can see how you can push this mountain back even further. If I had more time, I'd probably sit here and work this all day, creating awesome misty clouds in front of it. That's how you get a beautiful distant mountain that's gonna look great. And all you need to do is just add a little bit of color and that angle shader will really work for you. Okay, time to talk about our big mountain. But before we talk about doing a big mountain, I want you to think about perspective and where your mountain's going to go. Most painters out there are gonna do a few mountains. So you're gonna have a mountain ridge, which means you have to think about perspective and depth. For a real simple idea to keep in mind is we can obviously see that this mountain is in the background, which means this mountain has to stand out more with more detail, more contrast, and it actually should be larger in scale, which is gonna create a forced perspective from us to the actual painting. So when you're putting in your bigger mountains in relation to your smaller mountains or your more distant mountains, try to think about how you can make them bigger or even taller than your other elements within your painting, okay? If you're a brand new painter, I recommend sticking with that angled shader for when we put in our big mountain. But if you wanna paint like Bob Ross and one of the big boys and big girls out there, you can use your palette knife, which is actually not as intimidating as you might think, which is why I'm gonna show you how to do it. But let's talk about our color. That black, blue, and red color that we added white to, that we used for our background mountain there, we're gonna use that same color combination, just minus the white. Reason being is because when we scratch out some color, I still want it to be bold and vivid. And like we said, we wanna create some contrast between the two. And leaving that dark, bold color is gonna help a lot. Now take your palette knife and take a nice little cut, which is gonna be this little roll on top. Don't use a lot here. You can always use more. This is actually gonna help you if you actually use just a little bit. Now think about where your mountain's going to go. I created a video a long time ago about really cool mountain tips or the do's and don'ts. I recommend checking that out because that's gonna go into detail about certain things. But when you do your mountain, think about where your valleys and peaks are going to go. You can actually just scratch in a template before you even attack it with color. So that way you have a visual. The hardest thing for a lot of new painters is they don't use a reference. Use a reference if you feel intimidated, or use a tutorial. Pause the tutorial like Bob Ross and see where his valleys and his peaks are. Once you have a visual, it becomes a lot easier. Don't feel like it's cheating if you need to use one. I use them all the time, okay? Now I'm pretty sure I don't do mountains right, but what I find comfortable for me, my hand, and my visualization is I don't really always start at the peak. I like to work into the peak and pull that paint up with my palette knife. So I'll kind of start a little bit down on the mountain slope and work up to it, and then I'll kind of cascade off to the left-hand side for me, because that gives me more control. I don't know why it works for me, but it does. Give it a try, might work for you, but you work in any fashion you want. All I want you to be concerned with is the outer edge of the mountain again, okay? We wanna form that outer edge and think about the peaks and valleys of where they're gonna go. And just like our distant mountain, think about how you're gonna cascade the ends off, okay? Now, put the concentration of color near the peak because we're gonna be pulling down from that part. I just wanna take a moment and point out a huge beginner mistake that most people do when they're using the palette knife, okay? Is they'll load up that palette knife with a lot of paint and then they'll create their outside edge, but they'll start taking that paint and adding big dollops all the way down and across. You don't need that. Remember, this is oil paint. A little bit goes really far. Yeah, you can put a lot of paint towards your peaks, okay? And sometimes even near your valleys. But as you start working away from the peak, you actually need less and less paint because we can pull down and across. So wherever you think your mountain should stop, I actually want you to stop it probably 20 to 30% before that, because we can pull the rest of the paint down into that location. Doing this is gonna help with a couple of things. One, yeah, it's gonna make that illusion of depth way easier to create. But number two, the most important thing is we're adding less paint to the canvas, which means you're gonna have a better time sticking other layers on top of it. This is the biggest problem new painters have, is they put too much too soon. If you have too much paint on your canvas, you're gonna have a hard time making other things stick or making things like snow break, which you're gonna see in just a moment. But I really wanna drive this point home, okay? Go slow. Your paint will go far. Start with a little bit. You can always add more, okay? But start with just a little bit, because trust me, you'll thank me later. Now that we got our outside edge, I recommend clean off your palette knife and start scraping out all the inside of your mountain. We don't need much color here, but what I want you to do, as you scrape off the color, I want you to push all of that color into that fabric of that canvas. I want it to stain. I want it to be immersed in that canvas, because that's gonna help us create contrast on the underside of our mountain later on. So make sure you scrape and push in and pull down, and then follow the angles of your mountain. You should really hear your canvas make that nice, soothing, scratching sound as it's hitting all that toothing. But yes, you do want to work out that excess color, okay? But you want to push that excess color first into the canvas. With all of our excess color eliminated and removed from our mountain here, we just have to form the angles of our mountain. And I recommend, again, we're gonna use that angled shader. I think you know by now that you need to get an angled shader, which is why you should go down below in my links and purchase one. But use that angled shader to pull in all the angles that you want to form your mountain. Like I said, this is super clutch for when you have to get close to that edge, because it allows you to move and bump and close in the paint and really form your mountain whichever way you want. Now, an angled shader is gonna have a lot of stiff bristles in it, so you actually don't need to push hard. Otherwise, you're going to be removing paint. I recommend starting with a light touch, get that paint where you want it to go, then you can start to apply a little more pressure, okay? I sometimes forget this and you'll see me move color out of the way, but then I go back and I brush it back on top. Once you have all of your color and angles of where you want it to be, you can actually start to visually see the template of your mountain, okay? Now you can feel free to use other brushes here, like a fan brush or filbert, to really move things around. But once you got everything in kind of its place, let's take away a lot of the excess color by using a clean and dry 1-inch brush. I like to lay my 1-inch brush pretty close to my edge, but not all the way. I'll push it flat, and then I give it a little bit of a wiggle so those bristles push up towards the edge, and then it allows me to brush down with the angle of my mountain. And I'll brush back and forth and work out that excess color and work on that diffusion base layer. Learning that little wiggle trick is one of the best things that I ever learned from a CRI artist. Give it a try. Trust me, it'll change your life, because it allows you to get close to that mountain edge, work out some of that excess color, and then pull down nice and clean. Now your big mountain here should be prepped and ready and perfect for putting paint breaks on it. However, if you're a brand new painter that really struggles with putting on too much paint or too much liquid white base, or any base for that matter, I say do the paper towel trick again. In fact, you'd actually do it as you're pulling down paint to remove excess paint with the palette knife. Again, just make a nice blue shop towel triangle. Kind of hard for me to say, but I think you know what I mean. Go up there, take your finger and rub out the excess paint that's on the inside of your mountain, exposing that toothing. Then you can go back with your angled shader or whatever brushes you feel comfortable with and brush back in all the paint that you need. All these words are being difficult for me, but I want to be thorough with you. And this way you have a little more toothing for our next step coming up, which is going to be everybody's favorite part, of course, paint breaks. Now, before we get into paint breaks, which is everybody's favorite part, I want to talk to you for just a moment and promote something that I made for all brand new painters out there. If you like these type of tutorials and you really want to help support me and my channel, you can take a look at my brand new downloadable PDF that shows you all the best and affordable oil painting supplies to get into doing wet on wet or oil painting. It walks you through everything you need to get started at a budget-friendly price, and it shows you what to avoid so you don't waste your money. If you're interested, you can go down in the video description and download it today, and you get to help support me on my creative journey, which means I get to make more videos like this for you. Now, back to the video. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Ryan, I've never made a good paint break in my life, and I'm gonna make sure you nail it today. So you're lucky. So pay attention, because I'm only saying it once, unless you want to obviously hit rewind and go back and see this part again. When it comes to paint breaks, the very first step you need to think about is visualizing where your highlights and your shadows are going to go. Just like our background mountain here, if you're right-handed, making your highlights go down to the right is gonna be easier for you. If you're left-handed, go from the left-hand side and go down and away, okay? So that way you understand the difference between right and left-handed for any of you artists out there that are lefties. Now that we understand where our highlights and shadow sides must go once we've established our light source, for me, it's gonna be on the right-hand side here. I want you to scratch in a highlight template, okay? Take your palette knife and use just the corner and scratch in where you want your highlights to be separated from your shadows. Now, I really only recommend doing this on your bigger, bolder sections of your mountain. For your mountain ridges that have just like little slivers or parts poking through, like you see on this back side, on this back right side here, I just put in a little bit of paint breaks, so don't worry too much about it. But for your bigger sides, where you're gonna add a lot of different angles and peaks and valleys and a lot more highlight, this visual template is gonna help you a ton. Now, don't just make a straight line or just a squiggle. Think about how the light would cascade up, down, and around as you come across. A lot of those extra paint strokes we put in the beginning is gonna really help fill in the gaps, and you can just basically follow that right there. All right, we have our visual template, and you should see which side your highlights and your shadows are gonna go on, okay? Now let's talk about our palette knife and loading it up. I'm only ever gonna recommend one titanium white paint for brand new painters out there, and that is Winsor Newton Titanium White. This is extremely firm and extremely forgiving and breaks just the easiest, which is why I really like it, to be honest. Now, take your white titanium paint on your mixing palette and pull it extremely flat on that painting surface and then cut across it. Now, if you're a brand new painter, I recommend loading up the palette knife with a little more paint. If you're a more experienced painter, you can get away with just very, very little. It's up to you. If you're not sure, I say go somewhere in the middle, because again, we can always add more paint. Now cut straight across, and that roll on the edge of your knife should be even and all the way across. Right here is where a lot of people make a beginning mistake, and I want you to pay attention. When you cut across, you generally leave your knife kind of flat as you cut. Don't do that. You're already taking that roll and pushing it too far back on the edge of your knife. So it's more oblong. It's not really circular that's gonna grab anything. When you make your cut, take your painting mixing palette, represented by my hand here, and come in with that knife almost straight on and come down and cut across, okay? Come in and come down and cut across. Don't come in at a 45 or even less angle, because you're not gonna have much of a roll. That is the biggest beginner mistake I've ever seen. Come in, cut down across, and you should see that ridge stick off of your palette knife, okay? Now, I made a big mistake before doing this painting tutorial, and I had a lot of coffee, so my hand's a little shaky, but you know what? That's actually probably better for me teaching a lot of you out there, because when I've taught a lot of people, the hand starts to shake holding the palette knife as you approach the painting, okay? Now, take your palette knife and take wherever the peak of the palette knife is to the peak of your mound and line it up to that outer edge, all right? Now I want you to go ahead and just touch the canvas with that roll of paint. You're gonna see that it sticks, and that's what we want. And now you know where to start. So pull your knife away and then go back and rest your hand gingerly on that established white spot that we just made. Now as you come down your mountain, allow the knife to do all of the work. You wanna hold the knife extremely light here. And if you're not sure how to hold a palette knife, I've got a video that you can watch on it, or you can watch my YouTube short. I'll put both in the video description or hopefully in the top right corner here for you. When you have the proper grip, this becomes extremely easy. Come down and follow the angle of your mountain. As you're coming down, I want you to expose more of that blade, which has more of that roll of paint on it, by turning your wrist and forearm and kind of chicken winging your arm out a little bit. This opens up the blade a little bit more, allowing you to come down and allowing it to break across the surface. Now, if you don't get any paint breaks, that's okay. Very common, but I don't want you to stop. Go all the way down and across. Even if nothing sticks, at least it's gonna teach you the angle and the motion you had to go. Now, if nothing sticks, okay, let's reload the knife, or if your knife is still clean, go back to that same exact spot and just push on the canvas right where that white spot was and just jiggle a little bit. So that way you have a little bit of paint sticking. Then just come down and across. You already learned the motion, you already learned the angle, you already learned the touch. You just have to put a little more pressure or get closer, okay? And just start coming down. What's probably gonna happen is your knife is just gonna come down and skip up a little bit. Yeah, it's gonna create gaps, but eventually you're gonna find that sweet spot and it's gonna stop skipping and it's just gonna start grazing across that top, leaving all these beautiful little breaks that you can see right here on screen. And just go all the way down the mountain. And each time you do a stroke of this, you're gonna feel it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more to where you start making breaks easily. Now, before we continue, what happens if you try doing this and you just smushed your paint on extremely hard and you ruined it? You got this big glob of white. That's all right, we can fix it. It's oil paint, okay? Clean off your palette knife, scrape up that section, take your painter's towel, that blue shop towel, rub off that section so it exposes more of that toothing. If it's too white underneath, I recommend taking your angled shader with a little bit of your mountain mixture color and just scratching in a little bit of color. A little bit would be just fine and follow the angle. And now you'll be good to go and try again, okay? And then you can repeat the steps that we just did. Don't worry about if you mess up. It's not a mess up, you're just learning the angles and the motions, okay? If you put too much, it could be a few things. Obviously, you could be nervous and you could be shaky, most likely. All you need to do is just loosen up your grip a little bit and have faith in the knife and the paint as it comes down and across. You have to find consistent pressure. That's very key here. It's consistent pressure and consistent flow. It takes a little bit of practice, which is why I recommend checking out one of my videos on what I actually do before I attack a mountain, on how to practice paint breaks before I actually apply it to something like this, okay? Now, once you have the angle in motion, all you gotta do is follow that highlight template side that we did by scratching with our palette knife and just add in what you want. And as you come down and across, as you get to the base mount, you can put a little more pressure and fade out. Adding a little more white at your base is going to help with the illusion of depth because we're adding more light diffusion. Now, when you're adding in your paint breaks, something I want you to be aware of, especially if you're a new painter and some of you veterans out there, is don't put all of your white on your mountain. If it's snow-capped, you still see through the mountain and you'll see like glacier ice and dark pits and all these bottom rocks sticking out. You don't want to cover your entire mountain with white. You want it to break and expose that under base color of that black, blue, and red color that makes that gray on our mountain. That's gonna make your mountain look more natural. It's gonna make it look like it has more characteristics. It's gonna make it look like it has a lot of texture to it, which is gonna look beautiful. So don't overdo it. You can be heavy-handed at the top because that's mostly where the snow would be coldest at and seal at. But as you come down and across, feel free to lighten up that touch and allow more breaks to come through, because also the temperature is going to be warmer at the base of the mountain, which generally means less snow. And that's going to make you have this nice natural environment look to your mountain, okay? Now, something I just noticed when I looked at my own painting here that I want to make you aware of, because I do this a lot when I give critiques on this channel to other artists that are just starting out, is I want you to be aware of staying away from straight lines and pyramids. Now, pyramids reference to the actual mountain shape. You want to add bumps and some distress in your mountain because nature doesn't really grow in straight lines. You want to add some variations, and that's going to really add a lot of characteristics to your mountain. But you also want to make sure you don't add a lot of straight lines when you're creating your highlights with your snow and shadow side. And I just noticed it on my side here. I have a straight line that goes down. So don't be afraid to add some jags and movement in your hand when you're creating your shadow and highlight side, because this will add to a lot of characteristics. So it even shows you, I made a mistake and I didn't even notice it till I'm all done. But try to avoid straight lines because it'll really add a lot of just flair and detail to your mountain and make it look more natural. Now we can move on to the shadow side. Now I'm actually going to use a darker color here so it stands out on the YouTube video, but I recommend you probably do something light, but feel free to experiment. Again, it's your mountain. It can be whatever colors and whatever tones and values it wants. But I'm just going to use a little bit of my mountain mixture color with a little bit of phthalo blue mixed in so it dulls it down a little bit. Now the real strong trick here is when you mix up your color combination for your shadow side, I want you to follow an example from Bill Alexander. I want you to leave it marbly. Don't overwork that paint because when it has variations in it, it's really gonna add a lot to that shadow side and make it stand out. It's gonna sometimes look like light cascaded over or hit from a different diffusion of a cloud and came down and added all these different sparkles and adds all this different texture and depth, really making your mountain stand out. So leave your shadow color very marbly here. Now it's just like applying the highlights, except it's on the opposite side. And some people might find this easier or might find it more difficult, okay? But again, load up that knife in the exact same way that we described earlier and find wherever you feel most comfortable to start. For some reason, I always find it comfortable to start closest, the closest mountain peak section to me. I don't know why, it's just I always do. And I even know that's kind of wrong. I should work with the farthest side and then come forward, because that way I can build more layers, but who cares? It's my mountain, my way of painting. But come down and touch just like you did, and touch a little bit of that white on that highlight side, and follow down that same edge, down and across, and follow the same exact rules we used for highlights, okay? If you need to add more paint, go back and go on top of it. Now, finish out the rest of your mountain caps that you need for your highlights and your shadow sides here. And now you're gonna start to see that you have some very beautiful mountains that were very easy to make. Now we're not done. I have a couple of extra things that I love to do to my mountains that really make it stand out. Plus it allows me to fix mistakes. Now you may have noticed as I put my shadow color on, I accidentally touched a little bit of my highlight. And this is easy to fix. Clean off your palette knife, reload it with a little bit of white, and go over certain sections of where your highlights and shadows may have mixed in ways that you didn't want to, or even if your base color from underneath started to poke through. You can always add more. But don't be afraid if your blue shadow mixes with your white highlight in certain sections, or the base tone of the sun or even the mountain mixture comes through and dulls down or brightens some of that white. That's gonna add a lot of characteristics and flavors. In fact, I actually like adding a little bit of blue on my highlight side, so it gives it a little bit of variation in the snow. Perhaps that snow melted and then froze overnight, and then I'm seeing it again for the first time in the morning, so it's more dense. Think of stories. Bob is right. Think of stories of when you're creating your mountains and your shapes, because it really validates the characteristics and certain parts that you put more time and energy into. Now, when it comes to my shadow sides, I like to actually add a shadow highlight. All I do is I take my shadow color and I take more white and I kind of just plaster it on top with my mixing palette and just give it one loose mixture. I leave it extremely marbly. I come down and I cut across, and then wherever my shadows are, wherever I think sunlight kind of ran over or came across, or maybe a cloud opened up and hit a certain spot allowing sunlight to come through, I throw just a little bit of paint break in there. This gives it a lot of more characteristics. Again, make up your stories. I don't know. Maybe again, sunlight hit that, melted it and hardened it, and it's got a little bit of something in there. It makes it stand out a lot. Have fun with it. Now, in addition to these shadow highlights, I also like to go back with my palette knife on the short end there. I clean it off and then I add a little bit of white to that short end of the blade. This allows it to be more slick for the reasons I'm about to show. And where I think my white highlight may have actually broken or fallen over because, I don't know, erosion or temperature changes or just, I don't know, a small little baby avalanche happened, it could have gone on to that other side of the shadow, or sunlight could have been hitting a specular highlight. I like to take my little blade and I like to cut in a little bit with that white on there, just so it looks like little things are kind of happening. And I'll do this all over my mountain where I think that those effects could possibly occur. Make sure you just do a little bit of this. You don't want to be carried over, because probably where you are right now, your mountain looks fantastic and you don't want to play around with it too much or you're just going to ruin it. Now, in one of my past videos, I talked about highlights and reverse highlights, which you can apply to this mountain here if you want. That's a little more in depth, but I'm pretty sure with what you have, you're really happy with at the moment. And I'm super stoked for you, but we're not done. You still have to finish the base, and the base works in the exact same way. However, I want you to spend more time here. If you do not have a lot of control with your hands or your brushes, I recommend using a 1-inch brush to start. Start with the furthest parts of your mountain that are in the distance and start tapping in the base and following up the mountain. If it's super far, spend some more time here and diffuse it a lot out. If it's more in the foreground of the mountain, you don't have to push as hard, but tap up and down and go left and right and follow the angles of your mountain and really start to break up the details of that paint. When you've broken up enough of the details, I recommend switching over to a 2-inch brush so you have those extra bristles and start cross-stroking and feathering up the angles of the mountain. Again, if your mountain has sections that are further in the background, spend more time blending those sections out because it's gonna really add to that depth. And if it's got that foreground element, you only need to spend a little bit of time. That's really gonna help the characteristics of that mountain. Also, with our sky that we put in before, because it's oil paint, you may have some of that blue, or you may have some of that beautiful baby pink shining through the base of that mountain. You can enhance the mountain characteristics by pulling that paint in up into the ridges and the valleys and the crevasses, making it look like it's got these beautiful glows that are just bouncing right off of it. Now, just like our background mountain, our foreground mountain, you just gotta basically work out the excess paint on bottom, making it easier for anything you drop in front of it, or other layers that you plan on painting on top of it, like your midground or foreground, or whatever you feel like putting in there. For me, I'm just gonna drop in a couple of simple clouds so you get an idea of how it looks like when you have a final result. But you can do whatever you want. In fact, you can even drop in another mountain ridge if you wanted to. This right here is the best step-by-step tutorial on how to do mountains completely, so any new painter can become a mountain master. Feel free to revisit this video numerous times, and feel free to stop and pause at certain sections, and also make sure to look at the other videos that are related to this video, because I throw a couple of extra details in those videos that you don't get in this. This is just to get you started, and it's gonna help you nail mountains. And I know mountains are one of the most intimidating things when it comes to oil painting or painting like Bob Ross, or in the wet on wet style. But if you need more help, or you don't even know how we got to this part right here, I recommend you check out my cloud video and my sky video, because now that we know all three of these, you got yourself pretty much a full painting you can do. I'll check you all later. Thanks for sticking in for this long one. I'll see you guys all later. Take care, and of course, peace.